Are we live now?
We're live.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on Russia and Alaska, A Conflicted History. My name is Gunnar Knapp. I'm your moderator. Many years ago, I was one of many Alaskans involved in efforts to thaw the ice curtain. That was many years ago. I'm now a retired professor of economics from the University of Alaska. And it's absolutely fascinating to watch over these 3+ decades how our neighbor and our relationship has changed and evolved over that time. We had 3 presenters scheduled for our session today. Unfortunately, the first, Ian Halter, who was supposed to talk on the topic of suspicion and triumph, remembering Alaska's cession in Russia and the United States. Unfortunately, he had a total computer breakdown that ruined both his internet connection and his ability to send us his PowerPoint. So he won't be able to join us today. So we have 2 other presenters, and the good news is both of them will have more time for them and for discussion afterwards. We'll be beginning with David Ramser, who will talk about the thaw and refreeze of the Alaska-Russia ice curtain, and he'll be followed by Brandon Boylan talking about Alaska in the context of Russia's war on Ukraine. And what I propose to do is very simple. I'm going to turn it over to these 2 presenters in turn. I'll invite them to introduce themselves and to give their presentation. I think we'll hold our questions and discussion until they're both done, and we should have ample time after that, both to ask questions of our individual presenters as well as to engage in a more general discussion of Russia and Alaska, a conflicted history, which certainly seems to be continuing right up to the present day. So with that, I will be taking myself off the screen, and I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, David Ramser. David?
Thanks very much, Gunnar. Appreciate you moderating this panel, and thanks for your many years of pioneering work to improve Alaska-Russia relations. I'm going to blame Kremlin interference in my inability to show my PowerPoint myself and rely on Cody to do that. So I think we're ready to roll. Certainly, Vladimir Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has put relations with Russia front and center across the world. In my view, not only will he never achieve his goal of reassembling the Soviet Union, but he has made Russia a pariah state to most of the world, which has reshaped international relations and set back Russian progress for generations. Of course, that's tragic for the thousands of Ukrainians who have lost their lives, homes, and livelihoods, and it's especially frustrating for those of us who spent decades trying to build relations with Russia. It wasn't too long ago that interaction with Russia, especially with Alaska, was positive, productive, and rewarding. For a couple of decades, beginning in the mid-1980s, Alaskans and Russians simply couldn't get enough of each other. And I think these 2 photos illustrate that. On the left is the reception Alaska Native people received on a single day in 1988 when an Alaska jet dubbed the Friendship Flight landed on Providenia's runway to reunite long-separated Alaska and Russian Native peoples. That's the one on the left. And on the right is the type of reception I received 4 years ago during a 6-city tour of the Russian Far East to distribute a Russian language version of my book. I tell myself this must be what John Grisham feels like. I only wish my book sold half as well as his have. Today, this reservoir of goodwill towards Russia has vanished. And my plan this afternoon is to quickly retrace Alaska-Russia relations from the 18th century to today's refreeze of the ice curtain. I'll focus on whether Alaska-Russia relations are irreparably on ice and whether they should be. Slide. So let's set the scene. I think everybody on the conference here knows the geography of this region we're talking about, that Alaska and Russia are just 2.5 miles apart at the closest place in the Bering Sea, and our mainland's about 55 miles apart. Slide. To further illustrate this, in 1989, I was fortunate to travel with Governor Cooper to this listening post on Russian Big Diomede, where a couple of dozen Soviet border guards serve as the first line of defense against an American invasion. And then nearly 30 years later, during a boat adventure up the Russian Bering Sea coast, we stood on the closest spot to Alaska on the Russian mainland, where we could easily see the other side of Big Diomede and the Alaska mainland. It's a little hard to see in this top slide, but the island off in the distance is Russian Big Diomede, looking towards Alaska, and to the left is the community of Wales on the mainland. Slide. This proximity of our continents enabled a shared indigenous culture dating back 30,000 years, nearly to the time of the Bering Land Bridge. For centuries, northern peoples freely crossed waters between Alaska and Russia for hunting and fishing and to share a similar culture. Slide. In the mid-18th century, Russian exploitation of Alaska natives to harvest sea otter dramatically altered Alaska-Russia relations. During his 29 years in Sitka, Russian-American company manager Alexander Baranov enslaved native peoples as he managed a far-flung operation that reached from Northern California to Hawaii to Kamchatka. Slide. With the U.S. purchase in 1867, Alaska's presence in Alaska, which never exceeded about 700 Russians in the American colony, was significantly reduced. Still, native interactions continued across the Bering Strait. Slide. Fast forward to the end of World War II, as decades of relatively good relations across the strait screeched to a halt with the outbreak of the Cold War. Nervous about militarization on both sides of the strait, the U.S. government decided that national security interests outweighed those of Alaska natives, and Soviet leader Stalin concurred. So in 1948, the two countries sealed the border between Alaska and Russia and banned all contact. It is often called an ice curtain, like the Iron Curtain in Europe. So think about what that meant on the ground. You had native families who are accustomed to regular contact for generations were suddenly forcefully divided. And as part of my research, I tracked down a handful of quite elderly Alaska natives living mostly in St. Lawrence Island and in Nome, who are in their 80s and 90s and can remember their last visits to the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. Slide. So fast forward again about 4 decades after the ice curtain was imposed. By the mid-1980s, a drumbeat for change began in the Bering Strait, and I think it was the result really of 3 main factors. First, the memory of long separated native peoples were starting to fade, and they wanted one last opportunity for reunification before passing from the scene. Second, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes a new type of Soviet leader and actually encouraged interactions with the West. And third, Alaska and Soviet Far East government, business, and civic leaders saw an opening for interaction across the Bering Strait after 40 years. And what followed were a series of headline-grabbing and often risky initiatives by hundreds of Alaskan and Russian citizen diplomats to pressure their national governments to open the strait. Slide. These included a peace activist from Juneau named Dixie Belcher, who in 1986 took 67 Alaska performers across the USSR twice to sing and dance for better relations. And you can see former Governor Hammond participated in this trip. Slide. A visionary realtor from Nome named Jim Stemfel launched many initiatives to reunite Alaska and Russian natives, including trying to send weather balloons with notes of friendship across the strait. Slide. In 1987, California endurance swimmer Lynn Cox became the first person to swim between the Diomede Islands in nothing but a swimsuit, cap, and goggles, in water just a few degrees warmer than an ice cube. And here you can see her starting to land on Russian Big Diomede. Slide. Russians also push for openings too. Here, the guy in the center, who's the Providenia mayor, Oleg Kalinkin, wrote many letters of friendship to Alaska. And in 1987, he welcomed the first ever American Arctic research ship to his community. Slide. Now, all these efforts to chip away at the ice curtain culminated in 1988 with the first initiative with serious business and political support, which was Alaska Airlines Friendship Flight. The plane departed Nome carrying 82 passengers. About 30 of them were mostly native elders from Alaska, and the rest were a collection of business and political leaders and a lot of journalists. And both Gunnar and I were fortunate to snag seats on this flight. This single event generated huge international media attention and served as a catalyst for more contact. Slide. All of these initiatives helped launch several decades of crazy, emotional, and often successful interactions in business and culture and science and educational exchanges between Alaska and Russia. Thousands of Alaskans and Russians visited each other after 40 years of isolation. Slide. To follow up the friendship flight in '89, Alaska's governor spent nearly 2 weeks traveling across the Far East to promote friendship and exchanges. And 30 years later, I returned to most of those communities on my Russian book tour. Slide. One of the most lasting legacies of this era was creation of the American Russian Center at UAA in 1993. It set up 7 business training centers with American universities across the Russian Far East. And through its work, about 60,000 Russians participated in business development and cultural programs. It also helped attract more Russian students to UAA than any American university. Slide. To welcome Russian students, the University of Alaska allowed any student from a Russian sister city with Alaska to attend college at in-state tuition rates. Now, this is a fabulous deal for Russians, and it helped enrich the culture at our university. And between 1991 and 2015, nearly 2,400 students from Russia attended UAA, as many as 155 a year. Today, UAA tells me there are just 5 Russian exchange students on campus. Slide. So during this several decade era of positive relations between Alaska and Russia, there was much accomplished on both sides of the strait. Alaska Airlines, Aeroflot, and other Russian carriers established regular air links. Nearly 4,800 Alaska and Russian natives visited each other under the visa-free travel program. Businesses explored joint ventures from beer breweries to oil refineries. More than a dozen sister city relationships were established. Alaskans helped set up 36 Rotary clubs in Russia, and many Alaskans and Russians got married, had families, and became productive citizens of each other's countries. Slide. Alaskans were also quick to help their Russian neighbors during emergencies. During a massive earthquake in Sakhalin in 1995, I flew with Governor Knowles to deliver several tons of medical equipment to victims of the earthquake. Slide. By the late 1990s, well before Putin's incursions into Ukraine, relations across the strait began to cool for what I think are 3 key reasons. First, many Western companies just found it too difficult to continue operating in the Russian economy. The business regulations were too chaotic and uncertain. The ruble was suddenly devalued overnight, so many Western businesses lost millions of dollars and just said, we're done with Russia. The second reason is many air carriers ended service, so it was hard to travel. Alaska Airlines, Aeroflot, Bering Air, they all had regular air service for many years to the Russian Far East. But again, operations there just became too difficult. There's a sort of famous story about an Alaska Airlines jet that landed in Magadan on a regular flight in the summer, and for some mysterious weather reason, the plane froze up, developed hard ice on the wings. So in the middle of the summer, the Russians had put away all their de-icing equipment, and so people were scratching their heads about how to get the plane back in the air. The Alaska pilots sent a couple of guys up to the local liquor store who returned with 2 cases of vodka, and they got one of those old-timey pump fire extinguishers, filled it with vodka, sprayed the wings on the plane. Sure enough, the frost melted off and the plane was able to take off. There are a lot more horrendous stories about trying to fly in and out of Russia besides that one. And then the third reason was political changes on both sides occurred, which don't encourage interaction. When Putin came into office, he repealed virtually all the Gorbachev-era incentives to do business with the West and replaced them with barriers to interaction. I personally got caught up in that in 2016 when a group of us were detained for 18 hours by Russian border guards for a minor paperwork violation. Slide. The state of relations has been especially frustrating to our diplomats in Russia. Before the February invasion, they were looking for ways to circumvent the noise at the national level and find opportunities for citizen-to-citizen interaction. Slide. So about a year after my book was published on Alaska-Russia relations, the U.S. consulate in Vladivostok got a copy and thought the message of citizen diplomacy resonated well in Russia. And thanks to the Rasmussen Foundation, we got the book translated and published in Russian in record time. So off I went on a tour, visiting many cities I hadn't seen in 30 years. Slide. At that time, just 4 years ago, there remained a huge reservoir of goodwill about interactions with the US and Alaska specifically. We encountered many Russians who had visited Alaska, learned business practice here, and were successfully applying them in Russia. And much like American society today, Russians seem broadly split. Although Putin largely controls the content and method by which Russians get their news, latest polling indicates that support for the invasion is deteriorating. In August, nearly half of Russians surveyed wanted the Ukraine war to continue. But Putin's most recent controversial call for more troops has unsettled many Russians. I'm sure everybody read just a couple weeks ago where 2 Russians risked their lives in a rickety boat to cross 60 miles of the Bering Sea and landed on Alaska's St. Lawrence Island to seek asylum. Since Putin's draft call, strong Russian support for continuing the war has declined to just 29%, and nearly half of Russians want peace talks to end it. Slide. So in the West here, a major dilemma is how to deal with Russia now, if at all. Hundreds of international companies have ended their Russian operations. This has affected some Alaskans working in the Sakhalin oil and gas development. The few Alaska communities with active Russian sister city ties have largely suspended them. Fairbanks, for example, which has the most active sister city relationship with Yakutsk, has curtailed all communications with their Russian counterparts after the Fairbanks mayor requested they do so. And a significant fund source of Alaska-Russia cultural relations, the National Park Service's Beringia program, has essentially shut down. Slide. Now, I have long subscribed to the sage advice of Vic Fisher, Alaska's only living Constitutional Convention delegate and a pioneer in our relations with Alaska. He says, regardless of how bad things get, keep talking. One day, Putin will be gone. Given Russia's stature in the world, its nuclear war chest, its ability to seed chaos across the globe, it must be taken seriously. So I believe we need to be in a position to re-engage when the time is right with a post-Putin Russia. Slide. And I think we can learn from jailed Russian dissident Alexei Navalny. He recently smuggled a thoughtful essay out of his cell, which was published by the Washington Post, and it described what a post-Putin Russia should look like. He suggested that Western pressure on Putin, sanctions, curtailing business, prohibiting travel by those close to Putin, is useful in helping end the war in Ukraine. But the longer-term solution is helping create the environment for Russians to establish a different government, a parliamentary republic. Now, of course, that's much easier said than done these days because Putin has his fingers on virtually all the controls of government and severely punishes those who question him. Slide. And without being naive, I think the model of citizen diplomacy demonstrated by citizens of the Russian Far East and Alaska 30 years ago may offer lessons for overall US-Russia relations, though conditions are dramatically different. And here's 3 quick examples of how I think Alaska could be useful in a post-Putin Russia. First, there is a natural affinity between Alaskans and Russians, particularly of our 2 regions. We're both northern peoples, distant from our national capitals. We face similar problems to which similar solutions can work. And there have been regional organizations which span international borders, such as the Northern Forum and Winter Cities Mayors, and they have demonstrated that we can solve common problems from remote healthcare delivery to cold weather infrastructure development by working together. Slide. Second, we have seen that science can help overcome politics. During the Cold War and until recently, joint scientific research between Alaska and Russia was underway, leading to promising areas of cooperation. Russian and American scientists, including some Alaskans, should be prepared to restart joint research in areas such as permafrost, marine mammal behavior, and endangered native languages. And in the future, I believe the Arctic is the greatest potential area of cooperation between our 2 countries. Nearly half the world's Arctic falls within Russia, so Russia is the world's leader in working in the Arctic. And of course, we know the only reason the US is an Arctic nation is because of Alaska. So there's enormous potential for Alaskans and Russians to cooperate in the Arctic, from resource development to transportation. Slide. And the third opportunity is that links between our native peoples can build bridges, and today they certainly need stronger bonds. One of the great achievements from this era was US-Russian approval of visa-free travel by natives of the region. And that policy does remain in place today, but even before the Ukraine war, it struggled from bureaucratic challenges and lack of funding. Slide. So as the invasion of the Ukraine continues and Putin behaves increasingly less rationally in the eyes of most of the world, Alaska-Russia relations will remain on ice. But in a post-Putin world, there may again be opportunities to melt that ice. And I think Alaskans should be prepared to capitalize them. As history has demonstrated, we can do with success. Thank you very much. Spasibo bolshoi.
Thanks very much, David. And let's go straight on to Brandon Boylan. And Brandon, I'll invite you to introduce yourself and take it away. Thanks.
Sure. Hopefully everyone can hear me and see my PowerPoint presentation here. Yeah, I'm Brandon Boylan. I'm a professor in the political science department and director of a program called Arctic and Northern Studies at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And I am going to be talking about US Arctic security and Alaska in the context of Russia's war on Ukraine. I'm not a historian. I'm a political scientist. I focus on international relations and international security. So I'm very much coming at this from a poli-sci IR perspective. So the questions driving this presentation are, how has Arctic security, especially US Arctic security, been evolving? And I'm really just kind of looking at a short period of time, maybe the past 5 to 10 years. Certainly in light of the Russian invasion in February of this year, but also in light of the changing climate, which has been happening, since the 90s, and more precipitously more recently. And the second question is, what is Alaska's position? What is Alaska's position in this change? Both Alaska's role in US Arctic security and how current events are affecting Alaska as a place, as a community. So as I said, I'm an international relations person. I oftentimes think about regional and global issues in terms of international relations perspectives, and particularly international relations theories. And I have kind of applied various theoretical frameworks to this issue on kind of evolving Arctic politics. And from the discipline of IR, there are three main theories: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. And each would say something about current Arctic politics and current Arctic security. And if you're a realist, you're really seeing an intensifying security dilemma in the Arctic. And realism has claimed that there's a security dilemma, and there has been a security dilemma in the Arctic for a long time. I think that has been sort of overkill. I think if we saw a real security dilemma in the Arctic, we would see the US and Canada militarize much more than they've done. And I should say that a security dilemma is this phenomenon that when one state increases or improves its military for defensive purposes, it looks very offensive to adversaries. So adversaries worried that investment in the military, it looks very offensive to them, and so it triggers their own focus on the military and increasing their military might, to the point where you've got two or more states militarizing, and tensions are high, risk is really high, and it's really hard to walk back down off of a very tense security dilemma. That all said, as I've said, I don't know if realism has had a lot of explanatory power for the Arctic thus far, but certainly 2022 has been a turning point. We now see Russia's continued militarization in the Arctic, I think, in a new light. There's a stronger Russia-China alliance in the Arctic. There was a naval cooperative exercise between Russia and China that was spotted by US forces in the Bering Sea not too long ago. We have possible NATO expansion, possible NORAD expansion. Military exercises are taking on new meanings in the Arctic. And so I do think realism has some value in interpreting Arctic politics today. Liberalism is sort of the opposite of realism. It focuses on cooperation and diplomacy and international institutions as a way to reduce uncertainty and to reduce risk. And what's interesting is, although the West and Russia certainly have had their issues since the Cold War, they've been able to separate their combative relations elsewhere in the world from the ways in which they cooperate in the Arctic. If you think about the way that Russia and the US have disagreed over Iraq, over Crimea, over Syria, et cetera, and real disagreement, especially Crimea, they have continued to work together to cooperate in the Arctic, but that is totally changed as of the Ukraine war. There's a picture here. This is straight from the Arctic Council website, and you'll notice the text at the bottom of the image. The Arctic Council is pausing all official meetings of the Council and its subsidiary bodies until further notice. So the Ukraine war effectively put an end to the Arctic Council as of now, and no one is really sure if the Arctic Council will resume its work again. And in lieu of this, what we might call the Arctic 7 now, which is a term that I've only heard more recently. I mean, we used to talk about Arctic states or the Arctic 8, and now there's the Arctic 7, basically all Arctic states except for Russia. There's this emerging cooperation among the Arctic 7. And the West is isolating Russia in the Arctic now. And, this is a really heated debate on if the West should isolate Russia in the Arctic. There are pros and cons to doing so. But one casualty of the lack of cooperation among the Arctic 8 is it's really jeopardizing pan-Arctic research and science on climate change. I mean, Russia constitutes almost half of the Arctic, and it's very difficult to do meaningful, accurate science on the Arctic without Russia's participation. Constructivism is a theory of IR that focuses on ideas and identities and norms, and there's this idea that the Arctic is a zone of peace and fruitful cooperation, which is a line from Gorbachev's Murmansk speech from the late 80s. And constructivists are looking at how norms and the Arctic identity are changing right now. In the bottom right-hand part of the screen, we've got an image from the White House's new strategy for the Arctic. It just came out a couple of days ago. And I just want to highlight Pillar 4 here, which is Pillar 4 is international cooperation and governance, sustain Arctic institutions and uphold international law. And I've highlighted this one sentence here. Russia's brutal war in Ukraine has made this cooperation in the Arctic virtually impossible in the Arctic at present. So rightly or wrongly, the US is choosing to isolate or marginalize Russia in Arctic governance right now. Yeah, and so I would say that the US has only slowly increased its attention to the Arctic. I mean, most Americans wouldn't know that the US is actually an Arctic state. So I think the US has been slow to really, embrace itself as an Arctic nation, focus on the Arctic. But the Ukraine war has really further justified new attention to the Arctic and has intensified this attention. The military in Alaska had primarily been focused on the Asia Pacific region. And it is being tasked with focusing as well on Russia and the Arctic now. All military branches now have Arctic strategies, and I put them here. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, all have Arctic strategies. There's a DoD Arctic strategy. Again, the White House, new White House Arctic strategy just came out the other day. So that is a sign that the military is becoming more interested in having a role, having a presence in the Arctic as of late. The US only has 2 icebreakers, and icebreakers have kind of become this measure of how strong you are in the Arctic. And Russia has dozens of icebreakers. China has a couple of icebreakers as well. The US only has 2 icebreakers, which is not many given that we are an Arctic state. We have the Polar Star and the Healy. Both of these are pictured here at the top, the Polar Star on the left and the Healy on the right. However, there is a new polar security cutter program. There are 3 new heavy icebreakers that are coming online now. The first is going to be out in 2025. That's the projection. And those 3 new heavy icebreakers are going to be followed by 3 new medium icebreakers for the future. So the US is, finally investing in new icebreakers. They are going to be used for both the Arctic and Antarctica, and I think primarily for research, but they could have military application as well. I just want to draw attention as well to the planned expanded port in Nome. This is the bottom left is a model of the new port in Nome. The whole point of expanding out the port is to be able to accommodate deep draft vessels for maritime traffic. And thus far, the initial sort of impetus for the expansion project was more commercial, for more economic reasons, but it's certainly going to have security and military implications now. And the Nome Nugget just the other day had an article about how Senator Murkowski in this new Arctic bill is pushing for a year-round military presence at the Port of Nome and at Port Clarence. Other developments. Yeah, there's a new Arctic Regional Center. U.S. Northcom has launched the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. This is the newest DoD regional center. There are these other centers covering other regions of the world, like Asia and the American Hemisphere and Europe and Africa, et cetera. And now we have one at JBER covering the Arctic region. NATO is looking to expand right now to include Sweden and Finland. It does look like by the end of the year, Sweden and Finland will join NATO, barring some sort of derailment of that effort. NATO has not had a formal Arctic policy. I would imagine that after Sweden and Finland join NATO, NATO will come up with an Arctic policy. And, we talk about NATO expansion in terms of how that affects maybe Europe, but all Arctic 7, so the US, Canada, Denmark, Greenland, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, all 7 of the Arctic states, so not including Russia, of course, but the 7 Arctic states will be in NATO. And so NATO very well will have an Arctic policy, I would imagine. We might strengthen the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable. Russia used to be a part of this organization, and then it was suspended after the Crimea annexation. And that very well could take on kind of a new meaning in light of the Ukraine war and further enabling cooperation among the Arctic 7 in terms of their streamlining their militaries or leading to military cooperation. The North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, I was reading that there's a possibility that might expand to maybe include Greenland and Denmark. Greenland has already been supportive of US-Canada joint military exercises. And we'll see if maybe NORAD expands to include Greenland or Denmark. There's also a discussion about expanding the Coast Guard around Alaska. There's a discussion about the Navy. There's been an ongoing, long-standing discussion about the Navy coming to Alaska. But that, I think, would be very likely in light of what's going on more recently, that the Navy will have a base here in Alaska. And this article is from August, and it's just Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, talking about how NATO is going to be stepping up its activities, its military activities in the high north. So the war has certainly impacted Alaska, I think, indirectly and directly. It's impacted Alaska by way of how the US is going to increase its Arctic security. I mean, Alaska is at the front and center of that. It's affected our economy. So as many people know, 85% of Alaska's revenue comes from the oil industry. The Ukraine war has led to an increase in oil prices over the course of this year. Alaska benefits from that in terms of its economy, but yet, everyday Alaskans are still paying high prices at the pumps, in addition to, high inflation and high housing prices as well. And in light of increased oil prices, Alaskan politicians are calling for increased oil exploration and development. And I was reading that Murkowski and Sullivan give the new White House Arctic strategy sort of a mixed review, and they criticize the strategy for not focusing on new oil exploration and development. There have been some interesting Russian activities through the Bering Sea and Strait and Chukchi Sea. So I'll start by saying, just this past summer, Russian lawmakers have claimed that Russia will take back Alaska. I mean, these are, I think, bombastic remarks. But in light of the Ukraine war, I think, they take on new meaning and they're highly antagonistic. I know Alaskan politicians have kind of brushed off these claims, but still, I think it's worth mentioning. In August, Russian aircrafts, these military surveillance aircrafts, entered the Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone, which is technically international airspace, not Alaskan airspace, but it has caused concern for Alaska and the U.S. And although Russia did not enter U.S. airspace, the U.S. Air Force did intercept these Russian aircrafts in the international airspace and kind of were there waiting for the aircrafts to return to Russia. Just almost a month ago, September 16, Russia launched cruise missiles from nuclear-powered submarines in the Chukchi Sea in a military exercise. I mean, they were, again, in international waters, directed more towards the Northern Sea Route, and I think security of the Northern Sea Route, which it essentially Russia manages. A couple of days later, the Coast Guard encountered a Chinese-Russian naval formation in the U.S. EEZ. And although it was the U.S. EEZ, this is still international waters. So the two countries didn't break any international rules. But again, all of these activities, military activities happening by Russia and China have taken on new meaning, I would argue, in light of the Ukraine war. So David mentioned this already, and as I'm sure everyone knows, 2 Russians arrived in Gamble, St. Lawrence Island, Alaska, just the other day. And I'll just say that nearly 200,000 Russians have fled the military in light of the Russian draft to places like Finland and Georgia and Mongolia. There has actually been a number of Russians trying to seek asylum in the U.S., but they're mostly trying at the U.S.-Mexican border and trying to seek asylum there at the U.S.-Mexican border. But again, a couple have tried to seek asylum here in Alaska. And in light of this, in light of everything that I've been talking about, our politicians like Murkowski and Sullivan are calling for increased security in America's Arctic. So just to conclude, I would say that the Arctic is becoming heavily securitized right now, actually militarized. It has been militarized by Russia for a long while, and the U.S. is really increasing its investment in the military here in Alaska. We're now talking about an Arctic 7 cooperation, so all Arctic states except for Russia taking the place of all Arctic states cooperating, or an Arctic 8 cooperation, which I have mixed feelings about, to be honest. I mean, I think there's a real danger in excluding Russia from Arctic cooperation, given its geographic presence and its investment in the Arctic, its heavy investment in the Arctic. And the Ukraine war is definitely impacting Alaska economically in terms of oil prices, militarily in terms of, the U.S. is committing new personnel and new equipment and a new focus on the Arctic. And even politically, one example being the new asylum seekers. And maybe more will follow, I'm not sure. I would imagine security is going to be heightened after these two have entered into Alaska. So I will end it there.
Well, I want to thank both David and Brandon for really, really interesting presentations. We have a considerable amount of time left for questions and discussion. And we might just start off with a question that was just posted by Chris Allen, which I assume is for Brandon. Do you think Port Clarence will be revived as a military post, given that the Coast Guard left in 2010?
I think it's definitely possible. I think in light of the Ukraine war, lots of politicians and military folks are going to be looking to increase the military presence here in Alaska. There's a lot of possibilities. I mean, I think about maybe the Navy going back to ADAC and the Aleutian Islands. Certainly, no, like I mentioned, the Nome port is going to be able to be just a good spot to host the Coast Guard or Navy, maybe Port Clarence. I mean, Murkowski has suggested that. So, yeah, I don't know, but I would think that we're going to see an increased military presence, up and down Alaska's coast.
Next, I'd like to share a comment that was posted on the chat box by Yevgenia Onischenko. And she wrote, the shared Beringian heritage program here. She said, and I believe she's involved with that. And she said, we are active and have 21 projects going, although with some serious difficulties. And she's posted a link in the chat box to the Park Service's link for the Beringia program. So I gather David had said that all of those projects were on hold, but she's indicating that they are active but have some serious difficulties. I hope she might be able to share more about a little bit more about what projects are active and what the difficulties are, because I think that would be quite interesting. But she says that her connection is not good enough to likely be able to support her talking. I wonder, David, do you have any further thoughts, any insights on that?
Well, I'm happy to hear that. I know in 2014, when Putin marched into the Crimea, there was a federal prohibition on spending federal dollars in Russia. And so the Beringia program shut down. I know it cranked back up, but I was told recently that those projects are essentially mothballed, or maybe they'll allow themselves to play out, but no new projects. But it sounds like Evgenia knows something new, so that's an encouraging sign.
Yeah, I want to share a couple of observations in no particular order that occurred to me as I heard both of you talk. In no particular order, first I'd say, Brandon, I just feel, I mean, of course, it's just overwhelmingly sad. Everything about this Ukraine war and what's happened to Russia is just so sad when you come down to it. But it's particularly sad from our local perspective to sort of see direct sort of dramatic increases in militarization of the Arctic, which feels like such a step backwards, but then that's so much the case, isn't it? I will say it's as a personal reflection of somebody who was very deeply involved in these Russian exchanges that David talked about, but more so 30 and 20 years ago. There was a time when Russia felt very much like our close neighbor. I would get on a plane in Anchorage in the morning and 3 hours later be in Magadan or Petropavlovsk. And I did that a number of times, and we had visitors going back and forth, and then all that sort of dried up and sort of came to a complete stop. And then in the Putin era, there were very, very few exchanges, and I'd sort of, it almost slipped my mind that Russia was our neighbor. And then I was reading these news accounts since the mobilization of Russians sort of fleeing the mobilization and going to all these obscure neighbors Russia has. Finland's not so obscure, but Armenia and Georgia, and Kazakhstan and Inner Mongolia and Korea. And then suddenly these two guys come ashore on St. Lawrence Island, and I thought, oh my God, I had actually forgotten that we are also part of Russia's borders. We're right on their border. And so, of course, even in this extreme remote Russian far northeast, we see this phenomenon that's affecting all of Russia. But I want to share a little story from my last visit to Russia that was sort of a warning sign of what we're up against. I was invited to give a talk about Alaska salmon management in Kamchatka at the university there, and this was about 5 or 6 years ago, I guess. And in the evening, I went to a public bath, or a banya, which is like a very common thing to do in Russia. And I was sitting in the sauna with some friendly Russian guys, and they said, at the talk, and they said, "Oh, you're from Alaska?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm from Alaska." And one of the guys says, Alaskans voted that they wanted to rejoin Russia. And I said, "Well, actually, no, that's not really the case." But then all of them, all these guys in the sauna, they all chipped in, "Nah, you're just not willing to admit it, but we know, because this had been widely reported on Russian television." And I thought, gosh, this sort of illustrates the power of the media to shape a narrative that can be totally divorced from reality. And this drastically, sort of affects our Russian neighbors' ability to understand not only us, but their whole world. And I think we're seeing that. And so I would just say that David, I'm really personally torn as one of these people who's been involved in this citizen exchange, both as a just personally and as a scientist. How much does it have to be broken off? How do we re-engage? When is Vic Fisher right? How do we follow Vic's advice that you must maintain the personal connections? How do you even do that in times like this? I'm just really personally struggling with that issue. And I just wish there were some way we could say, well, in the Arctic, it's different. And we'll go on talking about salmon and permafrost and frozen mastodons and so on, because why shouldn't we? What does that have to do with Ukraine, except that it does? So I invite your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that's the dilemma. I think that's the dilemma that everybody's having who's followed this program is, do you try to send a message to Russia that their bad behavior is unacceptable and therefore we're not going to do business or have cultural relations with you? I mean, my view is we should do that, but we shouldn't end it forever. There's some theory that Putin may be run out of office before too long if he continues to mismanage the war. We may have somebody worse, or we may have somebody better, like we did after Khrushchev. So I think that we've got to keep our ties ready to restart on a moment's notice. And I think Alaskans are well positioned to do that because of the special affinity we have with Russians.
Great. I'm going to, Yevgenia has posted in the chat box. Again, she apologizes for the glitch connection, but with regard to the Beringia program, she's written, our program has never shut down. We just did not have a call for proposals in 2022. Thanks. Now, Mary Erlander has posted the question, what do either or both of you think of the prospects for the Russian people's interest in pursuing cultural exchanges with the U.S., given the poisoned rhetoric now coming from the Kremlin about the West? And I see there's already been somebody's already answered that. I'm not sure who answered that. Yeah. And I guess, yeah. So I'll throw that question out to both of you, but maybe particularly David, you've talked about these cultural connections. I guess the question is, given what the Russians are being fed about us, what will be the nature of their interest in renewed relationships?
Well, like I say, I think there's a lot of goodwill from the Russian side towards Alaskans. I maintain email relations with, I would say, fewer Russians than I can count on one hand these days. And in a couple cases, I've sent messages of sympathy over saying, man, it's just terrible, this Ukraine thing's going on. Some people are drinking the Kool-Aid and believe what the Putin regime is telling them. Another guy that I consider a friend changed email accounts because he was worried about the government looking at his email. And so he's talking to me through a different means. I do think there's a possibility of exchange. I think the actual citizens below the national level are very interested in rekindling relations at the right time, but it's just going to be a while.
If I could just chime in and just give one example, UAF is hosting a Fulbright scholar in residence from St. Petersburg State University, a Russian academic who applied last year and still decided to come despite the war. And he is here with us this academic year. And I think that's just one example of maybe how we can try to support cultural, educational, scholarly kind of exchanges. And I would just say that to the extent that the US and the West is able to, I would really differentiate between what the Russian government is doing and how the West is trying to isolate and marginalize the government and the Russian people, right? The citizenry of Russia. And yes, I know propaganda is very strong in Russia right now, but the extent that we're able to do it, to say this is not a sanctions war or anything against Russian people, but really against the government of Russia, I think that will be helpful because the Putin regime will end. We don't know when, but it will end at some point. And I just want to make sure that the US is going to be able to pick up with a cooperative, cordial relationship after the Putin regime. And if this sort of trade war or this isolation continues to affect everyday Russians as it might, then I think that's going to be really hard to have a good relationship after the Putin regime.
But how would both of you answer the question that's been bothering me ever since this began, which is if we don't convey to our Russian friends the situation is not normal, what your country's doing is drastic. I'm full of revulsion. If we don't convey that, if we sort of say, well, everything's normal between us, how do they get the message? Yeah,
I think we do convey that. What I was saying is follow the example of the Fairbanks Sister City folks, where they were prepared to have exchanges, I think, this summer with their counterparts in Yakutsk. And they said, hey, your country invaded Ukraine. We are going to cease communications and interactions with you until sometime in the future. And that sends a pretty strong message.
Yeah, I'm really torn on this. Is like the question, right? And I'm really torn on it. Like, to what extent do we isolate Russia for a long period of time everywhere? And to what extent do we try to find areas of cooperation? I mean, the Arctic is an interesting place because up until this year, we always said if there was one place the US and Russia could cooperate, it was in the Arctic environment, the Arctic space. And now that is thrown into question. I don't know. I mean, one thing I will say, now that the Arctic Council is stopped for the time being, it's going to be incredibly hard to restart it because the US is not going to want to restart it because it's going to look like a tacit acceptance of what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And so I do think the prospect for Arctic cooperation is really low right now. I mean, again, the White House Arctic strategy just came out. They're saying as such that Arctic cooperation and Arctic 8 cooperation is really low. So yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. I think about it all the time.
I have no idea how big our audience is or isn't. I would encourage any of your comments in the chat box, which I'm happy to repeat, or questions.
Can I ask a question of Brandon? I was interested in, it seems what was driving Russia for a long time was commerce in an ice-free Arctic. And they were interested in sending traffic, over the top. And they were claiming that a lot of the military bases that had been mothballed that they were reopening were just for search and rescue to support that initiative. I actually haven't heard much about traffic these days through that region. Do you know anything about it?
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely occurring, but it's not as great as maybe people think or the media makes it out to be. I know China uses the route to ship goods to Europe. Russia is very much interested in protecting the route, essentially says, it's an indivisible maritime navigation corridor, although the route, passes through various sort of international legal domains. But yeah, I mean, that's been Russia's line, is all of these military bases peppered throughout North Russia have been there only to protect economic, commercial interests in the route. But I mean, given the war, I think these bases take on new meaning. And Russia by far is the most militarized country in the Arctic, and I think can do quite a bit militarily if it so chooses. But I know the military exercises in the Chukchi Sea the other day were directed towards sort of the protection of the Northern Sea route.
We have a couple questions in the chat box. Russ Vanderlucht asks, from a security perspective, what are your thoughts about a combatant command that is focused, centered solely on the Arctic? Would this cause further isolation and marginalization?
Thanks, Russ, for that question. I think it would. I think, again, if we go back to this realist security dilemma, although the US in large part is responding to a changing Arctic and Russia's military activity in the Arctic, everything the US has been doing militarily in Alaska and the Arctic is going to seem to be very threatening to Russia. So I think the Ted Stevens Center, I think if we have more military bases, more personnel in Alaska, continue to have that military focus on Russia going forward, I think that's going to be very threatening to Russia. I think it would further isolate and marginalize. So if we did have a combatant command, I think it just adds to the uncertainty and the risk.
Sue Sharif has asked, how controlled is the internet in the Russian Far East?
Well, this is David. I'm not sure that it is regulated like we think it would be. I think what's more is that Putin controls every source of news, all the TV. What appears in a nadir at the end of Russia is what appears on the TV in Moscow, and it's Putin's view of the world. As I mentioned, some of my friends are paranoid that their email is monitored, but I don't know that to the extent that the internet is restricted. I just don't know the answer to
that. Maybe I'll just add, I think up until this year, Russian internet was actually pretty open, people could access an array of news and different things from the internet. I think that's changing. And I always compared it to China, where China really has a tight grip on internet access. But I think things are changing in Russia now. I think internet is being a bit more controlled and as a tool of propaganda. I know access to the internet in general is a problem in the Russian Far East, right, because of internet infrastructure. But I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that it's more restricted now than it was before this year.
I have a question first for Brandon, and then a different one later for David. Can you go back to before February and the invasion and talk about the previous 2 or 3 years when we were in a time of sort of increasing tension with Russia? How well or not well was the Arctic Council functioning in terms of the actual sort of ability to engage for the United States and other Arctic nations to engage with Russia and sort of say, well, all that Syria and all those other places, they're there, but we're in the Arctic and we're neighbors and we're going to talk about, I mean, to what extent had things already significantly deteriorated, or were we sort of able to have a different relationship in the Arctic up until February?
Yeah, I think the last thing you said has been the case. So, Crimea happens in 2014. There was some discussion about pausing the Arctic Council then. That did not happen. The Arctic Council continued to work. I think actually the Arctic Council has been really effective in what it does. And what it does is quite limited. So it was only ever designed to address environmental issues and indigenous issues in the North. Security, military matters at the outset were left off the table. And so I think, meeting after meeting and year after year, all Arctic 8 could come together and make pretty good work on participating in pan-Arctic research endeavors and working on indigenous issues. Russia has a very spotty history working with its indigenous issues, but I mean, nonetheless, Raypon was and still is a permanent member of the Arctic Council. So I think the US and Russia, there have been tense relations over the past 18 years since Crimea. But from what I could tell, that really didn't spill over into the Arctic all that much. I mean, these states continue to cooperate on science and environment and indigenous issues. And then this year, the Arctic 7 decided, enough is enough. This is too big of a deal, and we're going to pause the work of the council. And some are speculating. I'm not quite there yet, but some are speculating the Arctic Council is dead, that it's not going to open up again, that it's a dead institution. And instead, moving forward, we're going to have a bifurcation of Arctic governance, where you're going to have Arctic 7 on the one side and Russia on the other. And I think that's actually quite a dangerous proposition, but we might end up there.
David, my question for you is, what would be your advice to Alaskans and Americans in general, from a personal standpoint, on how to interact with Russians, either if they're sort of fortunate like we are to actually have sort of friends in Russia that that we have long-standing personal relationships with, or Russians that we may meet, say while traveling, or people such as the Brandon's colleague at UAF. To what extent do you sort of act as if life is normal and we're all just people and friends? To what extent do you bring up the current the Ukraine and all that? What's your advice? And maybe you can also channel how Vic Fisher, whom we greatly respect, might respond to that. But what would you say?
Well, I think the environment in Russia has changed dramatically. I noted during the Gorbachev era that the Duma passed legislation to encourage interaction with the West, as did Gorbachev. And a lot of people in Russia were excited to do so. Everybody wanted to be a capitalist They came to Alaska to the American Russian Center to learn how to be a capitalist and went back home and tried to start businesses. I guess my advice would be continue to be friends with those Russians you know, but I think I'd be a little paranoid these days. I mean, the crazy stuff that you hear about what goes on in Russia, even before Ukraine, there are repeated stories of academics in the bowels of some Russian archives in the middle of Siberia just being snatched up by the KGB, for no reason. You and I know many people who were key in this Russian era who are now banned from traveling to Russia for various reasons. So the environment's changed dramatically, and I think it's going to take a long time to work back through it. I still buy what Vic says, continue our friendships with those Russians you know, but I'd be a little leery about, shaking hands with some Russian in Britain who may have poison on it, like they did in that guy a couple of years ago.
We're recalling that this is actually Alaska Historical Society conference. I want to go back to a question related to the bombastic remarks in the Russian parliament about a long time ago now, more than a century and a half, Alaska was owned by Russia or run by Russia or whatever. Does that historical fact have any relevance to Alaska's, to Russia's relationship to Alaska at the moment? Is that merely a historical fact, but sort of so far distant as to be really irrelevant to anything, or does it stand for something? And if so, what?
Yeah, I think the historical ties between Russia and Alaska and Russia's colonization of Alaska have great meaning and resonance for today. I think there's a legacy of Russia, there's sort of the Russian footprint here in Alaska. I think about, Sitka as sort of the capital of Russian Alaska, and you still see a strong Russian cultural kind of environment there. Certainly these bombastic remarks that were made over the summer come from a place where, Russia owned Alaska at one point. And US politicians, Alaskan politicians, have just waved away these comments as if they're nothing. And maybe they are nothing, but I think it's certainly aggressive language in light of the Ukraine war. You have Russia invading a democratic state, and then also, maybe it's flippant, but flippantly saying that Russia, they're going to take back Alaska. I don't want to put too much weight on those comments, but I think it certainly comes from a place of this legacy of Russian colonization here, and it's worth mentioning.
I don't take it too seriously. I know Putin himself was asked about Russia reacquiring Alaska some years ago, and he laughed it off and said, "Why would we want Alaska? It's too cold," which is kind of funny from a guy who oversees Siberia. So I don't think there's any threat.
Brandon, I want to go to or actually both of you. What is this? There are certain areas where we sort of have to interact and cooperate to a certain extent and it's been presumably going on through thick and thin for decades. And these are things like search and rescue, fisheries enforcement, maybe, maybe certain research programs, I don't know. What is actually ongoing in the way of ongoing sort of regular interactions and cooperation, or what ought to be ongoing, really ought to be, but has ceased?
Yeah, well, the Beringia program has already been mentioned, and that's ongoing. The Russian Border Patrol and the U.S. Coast Guard continue to cooperate for emergency management and search and rescue purposes. There might be some Russian research programs that continue. I can't think of any off the top of my head right now. I mean, for me, what should continue, maybe climate science, a fully pan-Arctic climate science should continue, right? Because I don't know which threat is greater, right? The Ukraine war and Russian military aggression, or climate change, right? I mean, the climate is changing now 3 times as quickly in the Arctic as global averages. It used to be twice as much, and now we're at 3 times. And I think the only way we have a real shot of combating that is to keep producing good science about climate change in the Arctic. And that's just going to be really hard to do without Russia's participation. So, I understand the idea of marginalizing and isolating Russia in all areas is like, we're serious, this is a real punishment, stop this bad behavior. But if we stop this science in the Arctic, I mean, we're going to be really behind in what we know about climate change. So that's the trade-off there.
We have another question from Russ Vanderlucht. What major or practical implications do you see coming out of our newly released National Arctic Strategy for Alaska and Alaskans?
Yeah, well, so the new strategy identifies 4 pillars. The first one is security, securing the U.S. in the Arctic. The second is on climate change, combating climate change and protecting the environment. The third one is on sustainable economic development. And the fourth one is on international cooperation. I think, lots of people have come out with their interpretations of this strategy. I think one big thing that we don't see coming out of the strategy and the Biden administration is that, and this is probably no surprise to anybody, but there's not an emphasis on natural resource development in this strategy. And so we saw that in the previous administration, in the Trump administration, discussion about opening up ANWR to oil exploration, the Tongass forest for timber. There's this ongoing debate about Pebble Mine. I think under the Biden administration, if we believe this strategy, there's not going to be any kind of effort there to new natural resource development, at least in those ways. I think that to the extent that Alaska will allow it, there's going to be a new kind of a rejuvenated effort on learning more about climate change, again, to the extent that we can. And I mean, some of these things I alluded to in my presentation about how Alaska is kind of at the center of this changing Arctic, and the Arctic strategy is picking up on some of these. Like I think we're going to see, following from Pillar 1 on security, I think we're going to see a renewed kind of militarization of Alaska. More personnel, more equipment, perhaps more bases, and be better prepared in the Bering Sea, the Bering Strait, the Chukchi Sea, the Beaufort Sea, etc. I think about Air Force, in this regard. So those are just some thoughts.
Well, we're drawing towards the close of our time. I'd like to invite both of you, maybe first David and then Brandon, to sort of, if you have any final closing thoughts you'd like to offer at the end of this session. Take it away, David.
Well, just as Brandon was talking, I remembered back during the Obama years when Putin had to take a hiatus in being president, and Medvedev stepped into the big chair. And Obama and Medvedev had great relations. They created this group and probably had 2 or 3 dozen areas of potential cooperation. They appointed hundreds of people on both sides of the strait to work on these issues. And then when Putin came back to office, everything blew up again. But it seems to me that that's a potential model at the national level for future Russia U.S. relations.
Brandon?
Yeah, I would just close with something we've talked about already, and that is giving serious thought to this question about how far we're willing to go to marginalize and isolate Russia militarily, economically, politically, in all spaces, all the time. There are pros and cons to that strategy, and yet if we choose to break from that overarching strategy and work with Russia in some ways, there are pros and cons to that as well. So I don't have it all figured out. I think about this a lot. I do lean towards trying to cooperate in the Arctic because it just has this history and this culture of cooperation. And I think the stakes are too high not to cooperate in this region, given things like climate change, marine pollution, the flora and fauna in the Arctic, indigenous issues in the Arctic. And I would lean that way, although I'm fully aware of, the U.S. government not wanting to seem weak weak on Russia, and again, like maybe tacitly accepting the war. But we are going to lose a lot if this continues the way it has. And I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Well, I really thank both of you for really interesting insights. I'm sorry we missed out on our other speaker, who I'm sure would have added a lot too, but we're still not fully, the internet age still isn't fully foolproof, even after all our training in the recent or continuing pandemic. So with that, thanks very much. I think we might as well end up the discussion, and sure appreciate it. So good night to you guys, and good night to everybody else.
Thank you very much.